After e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, e5 is the move. Knight goes back to d7, and after f4 and all these very familiar theory moves, white is playing knight f3. We're in the Steinitz defense. White needs to play bishop e3 now, and the line I'm going to go through in this video is c takes d4 right now. In the previous video I went through bishop e7 and what to do after queen b6. So what happens after black takes the pawn immediately? Okay, so the knight takes back. Of course it doesn't make sense to give up the bishop for the knight, so the knight will have to take. Now several moves are possible now. What happens after knight takes? Well, the bishop takes back. It wouldn't be right to take back with the queen and then offer black to develop with tempo. So after bishop takes back, black can now play again. Several moves are possible. I'm going to go through as many as I can in this video. If black were to play bishop to c5, this can be taken and then the knight will be in c5. The knight's defending the bishop. Then white accepts it and takes the bishop. Knight takes, and now queen d4 is the move to continue. It attacks the knight, develops the queen, gets white ready to long castle and then create a file where the queen and the rook will be connected, and forces black to a reply. And what does black do right now? Well, black can't castle, and it will have to do something about this knight. So underdeveloping the knight will be silly, and so black defends the knight. Let's say what happens after b6. Also queen b6 was a possibility. So let's say after b6, white now doesn't care about castling, doesn't move the bishop anywhere. There's no need to give a check that allows black to develop the bishop. This is not the greatest of all bishops. So white just continues with h4. This move is already possible because, as we see in the previous videos, in this type of position, this bishop, as I said, is not good. So the center is locked by the other pawns in the same color of this bishop, making this bishop not very good, which is one of the reasons why black decided to protect the knight with b6. Probably also because this square will be a better square to put the bishop on. h4 is already possible, and these type of moves like g4, like h5, g5, depending on how black plays, they will happen anyway, and white has nothing to worry because, well, white is one step away from castling anyway. In fact, after short castle, white will long castle, and this position is very similar to the familiar patterns of the previous videos and pretty much how in many French games the setup happens to be. So whatever black plays right now, unless he blunders, white will continue with g4. So let's see, for example, after a5, which is a logical continuation, the pawn is trying to push further, and then eventually black rooks will be on the queen side, because it's pretty clear that in the French defense player, especially if white will castle alongside, of course they will have to start an attack on the queen side, because the king side is just only for the defense of this king, not for the attack. In fact, the king is by the other side. The white king is by the other side. White continues with g4. The idea is, of course, to push the pawns further, and eventually the famous f5 move, which might allow white to have full control of the d file, allow the knight to go jump in the middle, and also support the other pawns in the race against the opponent king. So what happens after? If black continues with a4, for instance, then white just plays a3. There's no need to allow the pawn to go further down, because, well, of course, for the reasons very obvious, black will have to also not just push the pawns against the opponent king side, which is part of white's attack, but white also has to make sure that black doesn't attack the king first, his king first. So these are not just random moves I'm showing, but rather just logical continuations. Black will have to attack the white king on the queen side. There are no other things that make sense to do right now, and if black doesn't do so, if black starts moving maybe the pawns in front of the king, or just starts going around with his useless bishop, then that will just white will just be allowed to continue the pawn storm against the king. So after this kind of move, a3 has to be played here. Now the idea of the white player is to play a move like f5. The threats are the usual. The f5 pawn will love to go to f6, and start messing around with these pawns, creating the weaknesses over in the squares around the opponent king, especially since the black bishop is gone and white still has a queen. Both queens are still on the board. These kind of moves, creating weaknesses and empty squares around the opponent king, will be very useful, and to start creating mate threats. As it's possible to see, the French defense does not allow much freedom in space to the black player especially. So there's not many things the black can do, and undeveloping the knight wouldn't make any sense, and the knight wouldn't have any good squares to go to. Well, the pawn can't also push because simply the knight will be taken. So black will have to play a lot of slow maneuvers to actually continue this game. The knight here would be taken for free since the pawn is pinned. Maybe an idea could be something like bishop this way, but after a swap of bishops, white pawn storm will continue. So black's main idea in this type of position is f6. Of course, the idea is to break the center and start challenging these pawns. And what does white do now? Well, white continues with the usual move, f5. The idea is, of course, to start breaking the pawn center built by black and make use, finally, of all of these queen, rook, knight attacking the center and control the file, the d file. So after f5, black can take the pawn in e5, for example, but that's wrong because after queen takes e5, white's position is just improving more and more. Also, white now has a rook on the same file of the opponent's queen, and it's adding pressure to the weakest pawn of the opponent. Well, it can't be taken right now, of course, but it's adding pressure on the weakest pawn of the opponent. So now black will take the pawn in f5. That's the best move. Or also rook a7 is a possibility. So let's look at the setup here. This pawn in d5 is pinned. White's continuation. If white were to move again now, the next move will be bishop c4. The pawn can't take the bishop, but the idea is, of course, knight takes pawn, and after pawn takes back, there will be a fork, and white will win quite a bit of material. So for this reason, the best move by black here, one of the few possible moves would be rook a7. Black doesn't have to play the move rook a7, although that's one of his best moves. Black can take the pawn, for instance. The idea is the preservation of black's material, so black knows that without moving the rook, that will be a future target, especially since after the bishop c4 deadly move. After this move, black tries to hold material, and if the pawn takes, then it's already too late for black to hold things together because this knight here is a monster. Bishop c4 is coming soon, and well, there's a threat of just winning the queen. Knight e7 right now, for example, if it was white to move again, that would win the queen. So black is going to be under a lot of pressure and will have to play very accurately, but still lose material. So what can black play now? If king h8, then knight c7, the knight will win the rook. The queen can't take the knight, and the queen will have to move away anyway. Afterwards, the knight will take the rook, so white will go up in material. If black will play something like knight to d7, counter-attacking the queen, then the plan is simple. White just saves the queen to e3. White has a threat of knight e7 check. Later on, maybe winning this pawn, and black's position is just falling apart. If black tries to keep defending this, then after rook e8, for example, white can just play queen to g3, exploiting this diagonal. Look at black's pieces. All of them are just completely passive, especially their best one, the queen, which is doing nothing. And after the knight's threatening to go to c7, rook will have to defend, maybe something like rook a7 or b8. In any case, white maybe just takes the pawn. And the position here, there's also bishop c4 available. The position here is, according to the engine, something like +8. There's just so many things that white is able to do and black cannot do due to the passivity of his position. So I'm gonna stop it right here. So after the familiar moves, d4, d5, and then knight c3, knight f6, e5, knight d7, f4, the usual Boleslavsky variation is on, so bishop e3. Now what happens after pawn takes, knight takes, and after knight takes, bishop c5, this variation, which is the one we're looking at right now, bishop has to take the bishop. And after knight c5, queen comes, let's say with a tempo. Let's say we can argue that. Queen b6 now is another way. Earlier I went through what happens after b6 and how to best respond to that. Now, what happens after queen b6? It's literally the same story. White goes on with castling alongside, of course. Black castles, and white plays h4. So whether there's a pawn in b7 that goes to b6 or the queen in d8, this just doesn't affect the fact that the white player is going to have to push the pawns as soon as possible. It can be argued that the queen in d8 will have some sort of idea of reaching the king side and try to defend its king a little bit more. The thing is that right now, this move here, I like it even less because the queen is further away from the action. So what happens now? So the idea here is simple. The black player wants to trade queens, move the knight and trade queens. The reason is that once the queens are off the board, this pawn storm will be less threatening since the queen will not be able to occupy those squares that will be able to probably deliver a checkmate, something like a pawn in f6 and a queen in g7 and all these kind of threats that can be made. Once the queens are off the board, it becomes a closed game and everything can happen. The game is way more equal. So if black were to continue the game with the usual queenside pawn moves, white will go on exactly like it did in the previous scenario. If black were to move this knight, where there is nowhere to put this knight that makes sense except knight e7, and move like knight anywhere else, it just will make black's position worse or lose material. So after knight to d7, the idea here is to exploit the passivity of the black player, whereas white rook, this rook is already active. This bishop can be developed to lots of different squares. And well, this rook will be strong as soon as these pawns have the chance to keep going. Black's rook is in a closed file. This rook is in the corner. This bishop is unable to move literally anywhere. The black knight is it's useless for the moment. So after this move, white can already start improving his position. So knight b5. So how does white punish black's idea, black's attempt of swapping queens? White improves the position of the piece and starts an attack. So black is potentially putting the knight in d6, a square where whenever it's defended by the e5 pawn, happens to allow the knight to be sitting there forever and control so many squares around the opponent king. After a potential queen swap, which was the whole point of this line that I'm suggesting to have a look at, rook takes back, and black will now have to play a move. Going back with the knight to c5 will be a bit silly because that will mean that basically black played the knight to c5 and then the queen to b6, then removed the knight, had a swap of queens, and now puts the knight back there. So all of this is just a lot of waste of tempos. White can just improve his position by keep pushing the pawns and play later on play the bishop to d3, and just white will be able to apply more pressure on the opponent's pieces. Also, knight to d6 is coming, so white's pieces will be much stronger than black's. So right now, what does black play? Well, black can play the two thematic moves in this position that make sense. b6 is one of them, because this bishop is never going to go anywhere from this diagonal. So black is potentially trying to put the bishop in b7 or a6, developing the bishop to good squares. This pawn is not blocked by any other pawns, so that means that the bishop in b7 could have some future goals, or in a6 as well. So now after b6, white continues with g4. The plan is always the same and always would be against the French Steinitz. Bishop b7, for instance, is met by knight to d6, attacks the bishop, and well, the bishop can't go anywhere besides just going back here, which is just getting, it just means that black bishop went to b7 and then back to c8, whereas the knight just improved his position even further, and white can just continue the pawn storm or just develop the other pieces. So after knight d6, black can try to play and maybe give up this bishop forever and play rook ab8 defending the bishop. White continues with a crucial move in this position, which is b4, basically paralyzing the literally the only good piece of the black player in this moment. So going back just a few moves, black here can play something a bit different. Well, after b6, for example, and white plays g4. Black can play the bishop a6, another square to get some freedom to the bishop, but this is met by knight c7 attacking the two of them. So if black were to move the rook anywhere, the white knight will just take the bishop for free. And if the bishop takes the bishop, then white just goes up the exchange, because what happens now is if black takes back, then rook takes back, and it's two rooks against a rook and a knight. It's winning for white. And if black tries some counterattack, maybe, I don't know, bishop a6 all the way back, then the knight is just getting safe. And if the bishop tries something like g2 attacking the rook, then just saving the rook, and then the rook is able to take the bishop. Sometimes whenever the bishop will either stay there, it will be taken. If it moves, then the knight will be safe, and again white is up the exchange. So another thing that can be said in this position after the swap of queens, this is not that far away from the opening theory. Another thing that can be said is black can play f6, the usual thematic move in these cases. Black's idea of trying to break the center is immediately crashed by knight c7, which forks this rook and this free pawn. So f6 is not actually possible to be played. Another thing that can be seen is, instead of this f6 blunder or the b6 variation, which has been said they don't really work, black can just go back with the knight. So what does white do when black player is just playing purposely passively and just maybe hoping for white to expose himself too much, or maybe push the pawn too far and then take over? Well, now white's superiority in terms of position and moves and development of the pieces can be seen immediately. The knight's goal, as I mentioned before, is to go to the d6 square when it's defended by a pawn. The knight here is sitting in a wonderful place. White is threatening to just kick away the knight, something like b4 potentially. The knight moves away, and then white is putting pressure on the b7 pawn, meaning that this bishop can't really develop without potentially going into trouble. So after a move like b6, for example, white continues with the usual g4. So that's always, every time that there's something like this d5 and e6 pawn, it's most of the times, not every time, it's most of the time, it's always going to be absolutely fine to push all of these pawns, because white's got nothing to worry. Black will not be able to put up any defense around the king side. So after this pawn push, black can do something that, well, makes sense, because the black player of the French defense is always going to be pushing pawns on the queen side when the opponent king is castled on that side. So after this move, and something like bishop g2 puts white in an excellent position. The goal now is to play c4 and just take everything. The pawn will not be able to take because it's pinned. So what does black play? Lots of possible ideas here, but I'm not going to go further because we're just out of theory by far. And I'm just going to mention what's happening here with the setup. As said, the black player has a problem here on the king side. It's just all of these pawns are going forward eventually. White's pieces are stronger, they're better developed, and white has a few threats. First of all, this d5 pawn is weak, and it was going to be targeted with c4. And then white knight is superior. Black rook on f8 is on a close file. This bishop is never going to be that good. So white is up a few tempos. That's basically how to sum up this position. White is up a few tempos because black was just too engaged in swapping pieces at the beginning and made a few more, way too many moves to swap queens eventually. So after a move like knight b7, which is an idea of this is basically me considering a very passive black player that wants to get everything swapped in an attempt of getting a drawish position. After a move like that, the knight can simply be taken. Also, what's the reason why black could be willing to go to b7? Well, because he wants to get rid of this very strong knight and maybe isolate this pawn in d6 and potentially take it when it's easier to be targeted. Here, the knight can take the knight, bishop takes back, white hasn't lost anything, white has gained the tempo, and that tempo is to be taken with the move h5. white is able to make a swap in there because his position was fine and he could keep the pawn storm. As a matter of fact, this pawn storm cannot be stopped. What does black do here? Well, how do you stop these pawns from coming there and just swap everything with the other pawns and then bring in the rooks into the open files and create a disaster? A move could be like something like h6. But this doesn't stop g5 from happening anyway. White has brought so many pawns on the king side, well, all of them all together. So what happens now? H takes, and then this one takes, and again we're going forward. Black's king is going to be very exposed and earlier than he thinks. So what does black play now? A move like g6 here. Again, in this case and in plenty of other cases that I've happened to show, we're way out of theory. I'm just showing what's the setup like and how to exploit it. What's the whole point of talking about this pawn storm happening? The whole point is so that it can be understood that the principle here consists of swapping all the pawns. And here g6 is just stupid because it gets taken and then the pawn is coming to h4 here, there. And I'm not going to bother analyzing more because there's probably something like a checkmate happening soon. And if not, white's capacity of penetrating the rook into the opponent's territory will win a lot of material. I already imagine some skewers in h7, king in g7, bishop getting taken, or maybe even some checkmate, depending on how black responds. Right here, earlier I went through h6. But let's say, for example, black plays g6. How do we continue this pawn storm? f5, obviously. The idea is, of course, to start swapping everything. If black takes the pawn with the e pawn in order to try and keep as many pawns as possible in front of his own king, then simply white takes back. And after, well, does the pawn have to take back? Does the pawn have to take this one? Does he have to take this one? Taking this pawn will come with the development of the rook here and an amazing position for white. Taking this pawn just doubles up and isolates the black pawn, and the next move is going to be rook to f1. And well, the rest is going to be very easy endgame to win for white. Another example could be after black takes and white takes back, black can play something like g5. But this allows white to play h6, paralyzing the opponent king, and then eventually rook g4. This pawn can't move without being taken, and rook takes back, and then rook comes here with a check. White's position is by far superior, and white's rooks are way more threatening. So let's have a look at another position, another scenario. Right after the pawn has reached h5, black can try not to play neither g6 or h6, not to expose his king too much, but rather play a move that looks a little bit better, which is f6, because what this move does, it doesn't really make the king much weaker. It actually allows the rook to go out and maybe then later double up the rooks. The pawn is taken, and after rook to f6, well, of course, playing pawn takes here is just silly because that allows white to start swapping pawns. That actually forces a swap of pawns sooner or later. So after rook takes the pawn, white continues with g5, and white is better, of course. The rook will have to go back and white can keep advancing the pawns. A move like rook f5 is met by bishop h3, and the rook will literally have to go all the way back, so and then lose the pawn. So let's say the rook goes back to f7, for example. The idea is simple: rook to e1, and white starts putting pressure on the weakest black pawn, the one in e6. This pawn is going to be attacked in plenty different ways. How does black defend this? Something like rook e8 is met by bishop f1, and then in the future bishop d3, then f5, and so on. White will have to just figure out in what way he will have to go and attack this weak pawn. The ideas should be the same all the time. Well, black's two pawns here on the A and the B file are completely harmless. They're really never going to go anywhere. a5 is not possible to be played, and well, one of the good things about putting the rook in e1 is that it stops the black rook from going to f8 as to support the other rook. And if black were to do so, again, the superiority of the white's pieces will be seen. The rook can just take the pawn in e6, and after rook f4, the rook is taken, rook takes back, and now after bishop d3, white is winning. So how does black, well, can black save the pawn in b6? No, because he cannot push it down here, because it will be taken by the bishop. The bishop is also powerless. He can't move to a6, he can't move to c6, because he will be taken in both cases. Here and here, it will be checked. And what happens after bishop c8 attacking the rook? And after the check, rook, the black player cannot save everything by going to f8, simply because of the check of the bishop. So how is it that this happened? And is it possible that all of these moves that have been played so far have to be memorized? Because we like something like 25 or 30 moves out of theory. Of course not, they will not be memorized. It's just that the patterns will be the same all over and over. So let's have a look at this pawn scenario once again. So here we are. After f6, white takes. Let's go a bit deeper into what happens after g takes, which is the ugliest variation, but still it is possible. And black may just try to hold things together, especially because he didn't want to waste so many tempos as it was seen before after rook f6. After this move, white plays the happy f5 move. Now, unless blank wants to get a really weak king, it should not be taking this pawn, because after the pawn takes back, then this king is so exposed. So after, okay, let's have a look at it. Pawn takes, and then pawn takes, and normal developing move like rook to a d8, also because this pawn needed to be protected one more time. White continues with the thematic h6. This is how this move should be played. This is how this position should be played. Rook f7, idea maybe of reaching another open file, is met by rook to e1. And now it's the moment that the white player is beginning to be paid back for all the tempos that were won during this game. The aim of this rook is to reach e6 and attack this weak pawn. Now I'm going to stop it right here because it's just with too many moves out of theory. Something like king to f8, get the king into the game. Maybe even try a swap of rooks that can try to let black breathe a bit. After rook e6, and something like b5 to protect the pawn. The rook will simply play b6 anyway to attack it, and after b4, white simply plays something like b3, and now white will go on with in a completely winning position, where even the engine agrees on something like +5. Well, the pawn structure of the black player is worse. White pawns are way further in the race to promotion. White's bishop is threatening. Well, white bishop enjoys huge freedom, whereas black bishop is just useless. Black's ideas here, there could be many. This rook will be a potential target in the future by the rook, because he just will not be able to be defended forever. If the bishop f3 and bishop h5, the rook will be targeting this weak pawn as well. This pawn is only 2 steps away, so after the infiltration of one of the rooks, it shouldn't be that much of a problem to continue this game. Going back to the initial position, after knight takes and then bishop c5, again the bishop has to be taken, knight takes back, and queen d4 again can be met by queen b6. Now here I'm going to offer a scenario where the black player is not necessarily immediately interested in swaps of queens, but rather just wanted to play queen to b6 in order to keep the queen going and start an attack. So as we know here, the move is castle, and after castle, white plays the usual h4. So what if black just plays a normal developing move like bishop to d7, and then maybe puts the rook on an open file and goes for some threat. So what about now? The game continues with a bit of an unusual move. Rook h3 is the best move right now. The goal is to play f5, of course, and then f6 if black allows us to. If black doesn't allow us to play that, again, pawn takes here comes with a knight d5, huge, super strong knight. So after a move like a5, for example, just white just continues normally. This rook here is being brought to h3 in a light square, but it's just not going to be in danger anytime soon because the center is so closed. The idea is that the rooks will be facing the king very soon, and the queen will go and support together with the f and the h pawn, which are deadly against the French king. So Well, a move like f5, well, f5 is not possible because white will just take an en passant, and after rook takes back, white can finally play rook e3 and start applying pressure to the usual e6 weak pawn. Moves like g3 will come and bishop h3 as well, and this pawn will eventually fall. This black pawn will never be able to go to e5 without being taken for free, not to mention the d5 square that is always going to be available for the knight. So that makes the position of the black player worse.
Right, so back at the start, black takes in d4 and the knight takes back. Now, unlike before, I'm not going to go through knight takes here because we've gone through that already. So bishop c5 is the next move, which makes sense. After this move, white continues with queen d2, doesn't have to worry because the knight in d4 is protected twice. And after black castles, white castles as well. So the plan is very similar. The ideas are the same, g4, h4, all these moves are coming. Let's go through a move that hasn't been played so far, at least a type of move like rook here. Many French defense players play this rook to e8 here to protect the rook, the pawn in e6, especially if they decided not to give up any piece for this knight in d4. And so now the knight is pretty powerful because it's still putting pressure on e6 and f5, which are two amazing squares. So if black plays a move like that, for example, white continues with g4. And then the usual h4, g5, h5. Well, it depends on what black plays. A few scenarios of what to do in specific pawns against pawns here were seen in the previous examples. Now, the thing is that these two knights are both putting pressure on e5, and well, we can't really push f5 right now without losing material, so that's the future goal eventually. But since the black player in this specific defense hasn't decided to take this knight, he will have to keep control over these two squares. Whereas in the previous example, at the beginning of the video, black took this knight immediately, so in order not to worry about that, but then got punished because of lack of development. So now black can play this move in order to put more and more pressure on this pawn, and basically this makes sense because black is asking a question here and say, do you want to take me and then I'll take you back? And then the rook is protecting this pawn here, and I can continue this game. I can develop this rook this time. I can set this bishop free, maybe take the pawn, and then get the rook on an open file. And the game is no longer a typical closed French game, but actually very open. And if we don't take, then there's going to be a lot of attack on this square. So black has decided to play more active instead of the previous opening in the previous part of the video where he was just swapping stuff. Now white takes the pawn, and now what does black do? So this pawn can be taken in two ways, the queen or with the knight. Taking the pawn, of course, doesn't even deserve to be seen because it's terrible. White still has a queen, the bishop pair, and two rooks that can reach open files very quickly. So, well, pawn takes here. I'm going to let the white player here just work out how to continue because there's just so many different ways. Well, after, let's say, queen takes f6, then white has this move, knight to b5. The threat is simple. The knight will go to c7 to attack both rooks. And so, in order to stop it, if black were to go back to d8, for example, with the queen to guard that square, white continues with bishop g2 and the threat of knight takes c6, rook takes back, then bishop takes back, pinning the rook to the king. But then there's also like great attack going on because white's pieces are enjoy much more freedom and space than the black pieces. So that will happen. Whereas instead of after queen b6 and knight c to b5, if black were to play another move, like for example rook to b8 in order to nullify the c7 danger, well, that actually doesn't work because knight c7 and there's a lot of pressure on e6. The knight's also attacking the rook will have to move again, and after moving again, white can push f5. The bishop is threatening a skewer, and well, this is one of those positions where there's just so many threats that are available simply because the position of the white pieces are more active. Let's remember that this bishop here in c8 is just a pain in the back for the black player in the French defense, which is why usually I think French defense players should increase their chances of winning by simply swapping the central pawns whenever they get the chance, like something like Rubinstein and so on, and then develop this bishop and make it play, because right now this bishop is not contributing to the game. So after pawn takes f6, going back to the previous scenario, black can also take back with the knight, which seems a little bit more logical. Maybe gives him more freedom to this bishop, even though he can only move one square. But let's see how to continue now. This situation is met by g5. Let's look at the pawns on the king side here. The white player has started an attack on the king side. These two pawns are very advanced, whereas black player has not started any attack. After g5, winning a tempo on the knight will have to move again. He can go to g4 or d7. Of course, knight e4 is not possible because of knight takes. It's a free piece. Black takes back, and now white can take this knight. Bishop's attacking the bishop, so white is going to be up a piece. If black were to take this knight, then white will just take the bishop, be up a piece. If black were to take the bishop, then the bishop is going to be taken, and the black player cannot take the knight in c6 because there's an attack on the queen. So after the queen moves, white is up a piece. So the knight will have to move. I'm going to go through what happens after g4 and d7 just to see the different setups. So after d7, for example, white continues with the usual h4, of course. The idea is to push these pawns, and white's got the three major pieces plus two bishops, so he's got everything that takes to checkmate this king that's going to be more and more exposed. So after this move, black plays something like e5. Now when the black French defense player plays this kind of move, obviously it's because he's trying to activate these pieces. So now he's asking a question to this knight. After pawn takes, the knight will be jumping to better squares, the rook will be in an open file, and these two pawns will have a little bit less support than they have right now. So after that move, knight takes in c6, black takes back, and he has created some acceptable pawn chain in the center. And again, after this swap, black will just be taken back and developing, and his position is going to look much better, especially because right now this bishop has another diagonal to go out to. Well, not right now because it will be taken, but he's got somewhere else to go, especially after a5. This bishop has some freedom. Well, all of these plans are going to be interrupted by the sacrifice of the knight in d5, so the knight wins the pawn. Simple, because if the pawn takes back, then queen can take back, and it's going to be a check, and it's going to be a rook falling for that. So that's winning for white. Now, how did we get to this situation? Of course, we're out of theory, but after analyzing all of the moves of theory, we've gotten to a position where we see what do we get after learning the theory. What do we get? What kind of position? What is the advantage that we get after learning the theory? Well, I've been saying many concepts of what to do against the French defense, both in this video and the previous two videos. And this is one of the situations, one of the many situations, where one realizes that the development of the white player is superior. The passivity of this rook in the corner doing nothing enclosed by a rook, and this rook in a closed file as well, and this knight having moved a million times, allowing white to play these pawn moves with tempo, is all penalizing black right now, because tactics will appear anytime your position is superior. So if your position is superior and you have more space, more forks, skewers, and well, discover checks, and all these things will happen because of course your pieces are enjoying greater control, greater power. Also, the queen rook on the same file here is playing a role in determining the effectiveness of the development of the white player. So this move is basically not possible. So we're going to have to go back. So yeah, knight d7 leads to a disaster. So we've seen what happens when you undevelop your pieces too much. So after g5, knight to g4 looks good. It's attacking the bishop, take the bishop pair away from white, and the knight seems to be in a better square. Well, the knight takes the knight again here. So unlike before when the knight was in d7 and was protecting the bishop, in this case nobody's protecting the bishop. So black can't really take the knight yet like this, because otherwise the white player will win the bishop. So black will have to take this bishop first, but white then goes on by taking the queen. So what does black do now? Well, he's still pinning the queen, so he doesn't really have to take it right now because the bishop is defended by the knight. So black could even afford to take this knight. So let's go through it. Rook takes d8 just to avoid the knight jumping away and maybe find some freedom. Well, it probably wasn't even possible, but after rook d8, white now plays bishop to h3. The idea is to take this knight and then keep a material advantage. Black can't really move the knight anywhere that makes sense. Wherever black moves the knight, even if he goes to f2 for example, the bishop will be taken and white is absolutely winning. There's nowhere else the knight can go to without the bishop being taken. So after, let's say, e5, protecting the knight, meaning that if white were to take the knight, then bishop could take queen, and then rook takes, and then bishop comes here. So black has some initiative, plus he has 2 pawns here that can become passed pawns. Well, one of them can become a passed pawn. So after a move like e5, where the bishop is allowed to defend the knight, the bishop takes. Now, of course, the bishop cannot take back. It will have to take the queen, and rook takes, bishop takes, and now pawn takes back here. White has a solid 1 pawn advantage, and this is a passed pawn. So his position is much better than the black player. Also is putting pressure on this pawn, which is isolated, so it will be able to be attacked and targeted very soon. So, and if black were to play something like d4, then knight b5 will do everything that necessary. The knight can eventually go and take the pawn, or go and sit in his favorite square, or according to what black will do, go to c7. So yeah, white's winning. So let's go back a few moves. Right, so after g4, knight to g4, white continues by taking the knight. So again, this bishop's attacking this bishop, so it will have to, the black bishop will have to take the white bishop, because it wasn't defended. So knight takes d8. We're following the principle that usually between two players, when they seem to be mirroring their moves, just playing the exact same move, the one that takes something first usually is ahead of material at some point. So after that, the rook takes back, and bishop to h3 is the move. Again, we're trying to get rid of this knight. This time I'm going to go through what happens after bishop to d8. Well, simply, the rook of course has to take back. And now where does the knight go? He's only got one square to go to where he doesn't get taken, which is e3. After knight to e3, see rook to e1, and knight goes back to c4. White saves the rook first of all, goes to d1, and right now the position is, well, we've got 6 pawns each. White's got 3 pawns here against these two, but there's these 2 pawns which are supporting this side of the board and also this side of the board. And here there's also a majority of pawns, these 3 against these 2, but again, these 2 pawns are offering black some chances. So that means that the position right now is definitely the best that black has ever achieved since the beginning of this video. But that is also two things to be considered, is that I've also allowed black engine moves so far, because I wanted to see what happens after black playing his absolute best moves to continue this game with dignity. So after rook d to d1, how does black defend this double attack on e6? Black cannot push the pawn because it will be taken, and well, after rook to d8, for example, there's knight to d5, the pawn is pinned, and white is winning the pawn, and the position of the black player is falling apart. So if black were to play something like rook to d6, then simply b3, kicking the knight away, the knight will not be able to go to this square, because knight to a3 will be met by king to b2, so the knight is in trouble, can't move away basically anywhere without being taken, and the only way to continue for black is rook to a6. But that comes with f5, so this is deadly. Because the pawn in e6 will no longer be supported d5, so the knight will be able to jump there, the file will be open, the pawn cannot push simply because, again, knight d5, rook takes e5, all of these moves are possible, and of course, taking the pawn here is just a disaster after knight d5, rook check, and so on. So going back, so because the knight in a3 will be just in its not ideal square, so it will have to go to b6. That's the only move that makes sense. But again, this comes with the usual threat of knight to b5 and attacking the weak squares like c7, for example. And now what does black do to stop this? Because if knight were to jump, well, first of all, the knight's attacking the rook, so the rook will have to move. The rook will can't go to d7 because of this deadly fork. Can go to d8, but then that comes with knight c7 anyway, and there's too much attack on, well, there's an attack on the rook on a8 and also too much attack on e6, so that cannot be afforded. And after rook to c6, again, knight just moves to d4, and it's going to be, again, too much attack on e6. So going back a few moves, in the previous variation, after bishop h3 attacking the knight, and bishop takes queen, rook takes back, knight goes e3, and after rook to e1 and knight c4, the rook goes back, obviously, because the knight was attacking it. And now we went through rook e8 and rook d6, which both failed. So what happens after king to f7? Well, this is met by knight b5 anyway. Knight c7 is still a threat because afterwards there's going to be 1, 2, 3 attackers to this square and only 2 defenders, and the black rook will not be able to go and defend this here because the knight in c7 will take it. So knight b5 is a threat. One of the ways that white can try to get some counterplay is through e5. The knight in c4 is defending it, it's not being attacked yet. So does white trade bishops? No, because black's central pawns are becoming slightly threatening, so white will have to go to d5 and start attacking this pawn, and the threat of knight c7 and then knight d5 is still alive. So black cannot play something like a6 because of knight c7. So black also has to consider the e5 pawn, because earlier black just pushed e5, and even though we were attacking it with one pawn and the rook, and it's only defended once, but there was also an attack, a discovered attack on our bishop in h3. Now that the bishop has been moved, black has to worry about his e5 pawn and do something about it. So this cannot be done because simply it gets taken. As a matter of fact, the pawn is pinned and the rook will fall. And after a move like this pawn falls. So black can choose to do the only move that seems to make sense right now, which is bishop e6. But again, that is met by f5 in this case, and white's position is much better because the bishop will have to move, so the pawn is going to fall. If the bishop takes the pawn, this is a fork. Not to mention that white will have open files and white going to amazing squares and so on. One more scenario, the last scenario I'm going to go through after knight to g4. Knight takes, exploiting the fact that the knight in d7 is not the knight is no longer in d7 defending the bishop. So after bishop takes and now knight takes, queen. This time I'm just going to take the queen immediately and see if that changes anything, but it doesn't, because after rook takes back, now the rook has to take the knight back, otherwise, well, black will be down material. So after rook to d8, what happens is this excellent move by white. Knight to d1 stops e3, which is the only square where the knight will be able to go to. This knight right now can't go to e5, f6, h6, h2, f2, anywhere without being taken. So knight d1 stops the knight from going there, and yeah, in fact, it is just too late for black to save his knight, because h3 will win the knight. So this means that, well, after black's best move, which is a computer move, rook to f8, h3, then the rook will be able to take the pawn and defend the knight, so get 2 pawns for the knight. But this is just winning for white.